veterans, and others who were part of other services such as Red Cross. Your interview will be filed in Atlanta and in the Library of Congress. Start with your name, address, age, and birth date, what service you were in, why you joined the service, the experiences you had, and how the war changed your life. You will have an hour and a half to speak, and I will wave my hand when you have an hour and a half left. Half an hour left. If I have a question, I'll wave my hand.
The second paragraph.
I am David Glustrom. Today is Sunday, September 21st, and this is the beginning of the interview with my grandmother, Marian Glustrom, at my home. Marian, you can start now.
I was in graduate school when Pearl Harbor took place. And I remember I was at a party at one of the other graduate students' apartment, and we all just kind of dropped our glasses and just stared at each other. We couldn't believe what we were hearing.
Where were you in graduate school?
At Yale.
Yeah.
Over the radio. There was no TVs then. And we just put our glasses down and went home. The next morning, over the loudspeaker at the college, came the announcement that every graduate student was to come into the dining hall to hear Roosevelt pronounce war. And so we all went in and sat down, and there was just a silence. And Roosevelt declared that we were at war and that everybody should mobilize to do what they can to work for the country, and we would win the war. And there was a silence after he finished, and then the boy that I was sitting next to said to me, Marian, for 4 years I did nothing but study King Arthur. That was my dissertation for my doctor's degree. And what good is that going to do me in the war? And I thought of the story later when Seth, my brother-in-law, told me the story. He said one of his friends who had been at Harvard with him came to visit him right before he went into the Army. And the boy was just completely distraught, and he said, I'm a poet, and I've done nothing but study poetry, and now I'm going to carry a gun. And the next thing Seth knew, this boy had gone into combat carrying a book of poetry and not a gun, and was killed. And that's, I think, happened more frequently than we all think, because there were so many of the young men that weren't prepared in any way for combat. Like Yale had never given master's degrees. You had to go right on and work for your doctorate. And so the men who went into the Army were behind men from other colleges who had masters. They could just show they had a bachelor's. So Yale just gave a blanket master's degree to everybody in graduate school, and I was a beneficiary of that. But graduate school just seemed completely irrelevant with the war. And we would sit by the radio and listen much more to that than studying. And so at the end of the year, I got my master's, and I decided...
What did you get your master's in?
Sociology. And I decided I would go into Red Cross. And I chose Red Cross because I really didn't want to go into the WACS, which was the women's unit of the Army, or the WAVE Navy. I just didn't feel that I wanted the discipline and the rigidity of the armed service. So I went into Red Cross and was sent to head a unit in a mental hospital, Army mental hospital, right outside in Long Island, practically at Sag Harbor, which is the head of Long Island. And that was a real teaching lesson to me. First thing, the first Friday that came along, the head of the whole Red Cross unit gave me keys, and she said, now we have Negroes in this ward, lock the door so they won't get out. And I said, why can't they get out? And she said, well, we have a dance every Friday night, and the girls from the village won't come if there are Negro soldiers there to dance with. Their mothers won't let them. Now, this was up north in Long Island. And so the Red Cross, there were about 5 of us there who decided we were going to do something about it. And we came to our head of the unit, and we told them that we would not participate in the dance if they didn't allow the Negroes. And so they stopped the dances. And when I came...
What was the name of the hospital that you were at?
A Mason General. It was a mental hospital for the county, and the Red Cross Army had taken it over. We had Italian prisoners of war there too, and they were up on the top floor, and they were like children. They would wave to us and smile, kind of, And it was almost likable. We forgot almost that they were prisoners of war. And it was in sharp contrast to when I met German prisoners of war, and I'll go into that later. The Army hospital really impressed me because though I had been working in mental hospitals before and had a very good background in psychology, they did things that I had never seen before. One was they used self-hypnosis and hypnosis. They used shock treatment, which at that time was absolutely horrible. The men went into just complete convulsions and never were the same after those shock treatments. They also used sodium pentothal to get the men to talk. And it was, to me, it was so incredible, some of the stories they told. Like one man who said that he had awakened in the foxhole and he was the only live person left of the 10 soldiers in that foxhole. And he was covered with dead soldiers. And you wondered how he even remained as sane as he did, even though he was a man, had a complete breakdown. One morning, we were awakened at 2 in the morning over the loudspeaker. It said, "Everybody report to their stations. We are getting ambulances from the front." And it was a battle of the Bulge. And they had so many wounded and men who had had breakdowns and everything that they had just put them in planes and ships and shipped them across the Atlantic before the men even knew where they were going, what they were doing. And it was about 3 in the morning when the first ambulance came, and I still can remember going out and helping one man out and then another. They were 18 and 19 years old, completely unaware of what they walked like puppets. You had to take them by the hand and bring them in, and we gave them coffee and cookies and cake, and they just sat there. And the saddest thing were the young men who were 18 and 19 who had gotten married before they went overseas, and they hardly knew their wives, and their wives hardly knew them. And they said to us, "Don't tell my wife I'm in a mental hospital." And we said, "Well, we have to notify the next of kin." And they said, "Well, just tell her that you don't know where I am." And it was sad when these young girls, too, came to visit their husbands who they hardly know, and their husbands just lay there and didn't hardly know them. And they hated General Patton with a passion. They felt that he had pushed them into combat before they were ready. I can still see the scene of the ambulances arriving and are going one by one, taking these men by the hand and leading them in and sitting down with them for coffee or cake or cookies. And they would just look at me, and I could hardly keep from crying. And I cry now when I think of it. After about 10 months at Mason General, they promoted me to the head of a big unit in Tilton General at Fort Dix. And that was a big Army medical hospital. And it was a scene, again, new to me.
Where was it? Where was that?
At Fort Dix in New Jersey.
New Jersey. Yeah.
Fort Dix is a huge camp, Fort Dix, and the hospital was very large. And it was my first experience with wounded soldiers. I'd worked my way through college in the University of Minnesota Hospital, and I was used to sick people, but I wasn't used to seeing men without arms or legs or blind or their faces all cut up or couldn't breathe. As we went through the ward, it was just, and you never could show, of course, how you felt when you looked or talked to this man. They, though, were very eager to have their families come, and then we had to talk to the families before they saw their blind son or husband, their son without an arm, or their husband without 2 arms or no legs, or their lungs punctured. And it was right after the Battle of the Bulge, and the Battle of the Bulge was so bad that they were throwing men in without any experience. Any man who could carry a gun almost was thrown into and for the first time, they used black or Negroes, as they called them then, for combat. Up to then, they would not let a Negro fight. They drove trucks, they built roads, they did this, maintenance, but they could not fight. And they gave them guns for the first time in the Battle of the Bulge. And one of the men who saw this said to me, "You know, you white boys looked in shock and said, you know, they can fight." And this was the United States Army. Fort Dix, as I say, was a completely different experience in the mental hospital. And we had German prisoners there. And these prisoners were from the elite African and Youth Corps. And they were the Aryans that Hitler was shaping his population. They were blonde, blue-eyed, built well. And they were so arrogant that you could hardly stand to look at them. They could be scrubbing the floor and say, myself or another woman walked by, and you could feel them almost undressing you. Nothing could stop their arrogance. I was at Fort Dix when I came down for breakfast one day. It was April 12th, and the hospital had an eerie quiet, and there were men in wheelchairs and litters, and a lot of the nurses were in this big recreation room. And I walked in, and I said, "What's happened?" And everybody was crying, and they said, "Roosevelt has died." And I just burst into tears. He was our savior. He was our leader. We had complete faith in him, and this was his third term. No other president has ever served and a third term, and no others will, because they passed a law after that. But they locked up, the German prisoners were so arrogant that they locked him up that day because they were afraid they would make a comment about Roosevelt. And so that just shows you the German mentality, too, that was so different from the Italian. The Italians were like children, and the Germans were, when I think of it now, I sort of tighten up. The other interesting thing that happened to me at Fort Dix, which was not had anything to do with the hospital, my brother had stationed at Fort Dix for a short while before he went overseas. And they had a 6-month-old baby. I don't know if you remember your cousin Margaret. She was here for both your bar mitzvahs and Ann's wedding. And she was 6 months old, and Betty, David's wife, said, "David is on guard duty, so he can't join us today, but I'm going to give you a special treat. We're going to Princeton, and we're going to see Albert Einstein." And I said, "We're going to see Albert Einstein?" She said, "How?" And she said, "We drove to Princeton, and there was a whole line of cars going slow with their windows open, and everybody was waving. And every afternoon it turned out that Albert Einstein, who had just retired from Princeton, would sit out on the boulevard in a folding chair, and everybody knew it, and they would all come by and wave. And here he was with this white shock of hair." And Betty held the 6-month-old baby, Margaret, out and said, "Look, Margaret, you're looking at the smartest man that probably ever lived." And I could still see him with that white hair and waving away and smiling at us. And I don't know if you saw the movie A Beautiful Mind.
Yes.
Well, Einstein was very instrumental in getting this man from A Beautiful Mind money and grants so that he could survive. Because this man had come from Princeton. So then the other thing that happened while I was at Fort Dix, I was sent to some meetings in Washington, and I had friends who were working on the Manhattan Project who didn't know what they were working on, and we never knew. We were walking along the streets in Washington, all of a sudden there was a yelp from everybody around. The atomic bomb had been dropped. And it was such a relief. We thought, no more killing, no more wounded, no more sickness, no more separation. And it shows how thinking is generational. If you ask me now, would you want to drop the atomic bomb? I'd say, I hope we never have to drop it. But at that time, and Johnny can tell you something about that, after all his time in Europe, he was in Reims, waiting to be shipped to the Pacific. And the bomb dropped. And I can't tell you how we felt. We were almost singing. And when the war ended, it was the same, even more so. But I don't think anyone who ever lived through the World War II could understand the joy we had when we heard that that horrible thing had been dropped. And immediately I knew what all my physicist friends and chemical friends, had been working on. It had been the best kept secret, I think, that's ever been kept in this country. Nobody, even the top people, didn't know what they were working on, except, Oppenheimer and Teller and that group of men. So right after the atomic bomb they promoted me again, and sent me to Brooklyn Naval Hospital. And there I met a completely different kind of patient. First, there was much more of an autocracy in the Navy and the Marines. The officers sat here, and the listed men were here, and never the twain did meet except in battle. I also, for the first time, met regular Marines who had been in the Marine Corps before World War II. And they were fighters, they were soldiers, and they hated the Japanese with such a passion that our hatred of the Germans was nothing. I mean, they couldn't even call them human, because they had, they found Marines hung by their feet all over the islands as the Marines came in. They were really, I knew a master sergeant of Marines was sent over to my unit to help me. And I got to know him very well. He was a very handsome, charming, regular Marine, but he was a soldier. I mean, I'd never met anybody that thought that way. They had no hesitancy to kill or wound. I mean, they were fighting for this, they felt they were fighting for a cause, and they were soldiers. And they were I never met the men at Fort Dix that were from mostly, the European and the Pacific, that were like these regular Marines, but they were very prejudiced. We had one big ward for convalescents, and these regular Marine sergeants, mostly they were master sergeants, would not have a bed next to a Negro or a Jew. Though they worked for me and they came to me for help, I was the only Jewish person in all my units. They would not sleep next to one. And the Navy the Marine Corps never said you have to. They would move their beds for them. And this, again, was the United States Navy and Marines. The Naval Hospital, too, was very different. We had practically no one from the Europe. They were all from the Pacific. And as I say, their whole thinking was different than the men I'd met from Europe. And even from the soldiers that I'd met in the Pacific, their thinking was different, because most of them, the Navy was, to say, we ate in the officers' dining hall. We always did in every hospital. But in every hospital, we could even date soldiers, but not in the Navy. If you were in the officers' mess, or you did not have anything to do with an enlisted man unless you were working with him or he was working for you. And I got to know a lot of the enlisted men well, and we would invite them to our parties, but then we didn't invite the officers. If we had a party that was officers, we couldn't invite. And I didn't find that in the Army as much as I did in the Marine Corps and the Navy. The Navy especially was very, how shall I say, autocratic, almost prejudiced in a way there. I don't think there were a lot of Jewish naval officers, do you?
Rick Vogel.
Then the war ended, and I was on Broadway with a group of other Red Cross people, and people just went crazy. I mean, Broadway was always crowded, but people were they were dancing, every time a soldier would meet us, they would kiss us. It was just an incredible thing that after all these years, the war was over. And then the Naval Hospital got to be less interesting, because instead of getting combat wounded, we got men who came in for appendectomies. They were still in the Navy, so they could get their medical care. So I decided...
Did you find that those men were racist also, or were they better than the other ones?
You mean the
new ones that came in?
The enlisted men were not as racist as the regular.
How did you feel when you were working next to the racist? When you had...
Well, I would have said, you sleep here and that's it.
Right.
But that isn't what the Navy or the Marines said. But the Army was racist. they would not allow Negroes to fight in combat. Harold Fleming, who was a good friend of ours, this is a funny story, it has nothing to do with me, but he was at Harvard, and when he was drafted, and he was doing KP and scrubbing the floor when this sergeant came to him and said, "Fleming, you got a telegram." And Harold said, "Well, my hands are wet. Can you read it for me?" He said, "Oh, it's nothing. You've been elected to a fraternity, Phi Beta Kappa." And Harold was sent to the Pacific to head an all-black unit because he was from Atlanta. Southern men knew how to treat niggers.
What about anti-Semitism? Did you?
I did not, I did it once. When I was at the Brooklyn Naval Hospital, we had a woman at the head of the whole unit, see, I was a subhead, I had met her former head when I was a Mason General, was in the same position I had, and she told me that this woman was very anti-Semitic and that she'd gotten her demoted. And she tried that with me. And the only reason I could figure out was that I was Jewish. But otherwise, I did not feel any from the soldiers I worked with, or the Navy officers took me out. There might have been, but they certainly didn't. Now, granted, a lot of them may not have known I was even Jewish.
Yeah.
Because, the name Brody, my name was Brody. It isn't and I didn't act, I guess, as I thought a Jew should act. I can't say, with this one woman, though.
Yeah.
And Red Cross did have a reputation of being anti-Semitic. But I did not find it. They promoted me, and at the end I was at the very top.
Mm-hmm.
So when the war ended, I just decided I would resign and go home for a while and take stock. But before I went home, my brother came in from overseas. And he was classification officer, so he was the last man to be discharged because every man had to go through him. So we met in New York the day after he got back to this country, after 2.5 years of overseas. And I said, "What do you want to do, David?" And he said, "Let's go down to the east side and eat I want some stuffed cabbage." And so we went down, and it was New Year's Eve, and he said, "Now let's go up to Times Square. I've always wanted to see Times Square, New Year's Eve." And it was very exciting because it was full of uniforms. Everybody was happy. It was the first New Year's Eve of the end of the war. It was and I still remember David and I just being one of this huge crowd. And then David went back to Camp Kilmer. That's where you were discharged from too. And I then decided to go on home. The war changed me a lot. First, it made me realize how much our society needed changing. I was a sociologist, and that the war had started it. And that years later, when I read Stephen Ambrose's book, The Citizen Soldier, and at the end he says, it wasn't the generals that won the war, it was the citizen soldiers. And knowing the men that I had seen go through being wounded, mental patients spring out of it, Navy and Marine, I'm sure he was right. But I didn't feel like going back to graduate school. And so I decided I would get a job in New York. I like New York. And maybe I'd take some classes in Columbia and change my life because there was Johnny in New York. And as we talk to men, most of them say one of the ways they changed their life was that they met their wives. But I think it also changed our society. I think it opened the way for civil rights. And when the blacks who came back were not about to take a subservient role. I think it increased our interest in science, that we got more science majors. It was just, I would feel it was the beginning of a new society. Do you have any more questions? Any questions you'd like to ask me? Bobby? Yeah. It was an experience that I'm glad I had, but that I'm sorry also that I had to have.
There was a terrible struggle going on. the United States was serving as the arsenal of democracy, and our factories were trying to equalize the German production facilities and keep up with them. And so that's why they called it the arsenal of democracy, to build up planes, vehicles for the military, cannon, artillery, and rifles and pistols, and so forth.
And
There was a
Roosevelt-
terrible situation because in the factories, none of them would employ any black people. And they were very open and blatant about it. And the black people were threatening to strike and to march on Washington and to do what they could to break down this racial barrier, because they figured that if they couldn't break it down during wartime, they could never break it. And so there was a monumental struggle between the blacks and the whites on the question of employment. And to show you how bad the thing was, I never saw a black soldier the whole time I was in England, France, and Germany. And I understand there was a handful, but very few combat. They prefer to send the whites over to get killed in the war.
There's one other thing that I didn't say about Mason General, the mental hospital. We were so short of psychiatrists that they encouraged young doctors, who, and there was apparently no women doctors then, who had just finished their residency, to come to Mason General, and for 3 months they trained them to be psychiatrists. Well, and most of them were not even interested in psychiatry, but it was a way of getting out of going overseas or being in the medical corps, which was much more dangerous. And I often wonder if some of these men I know that I really shook my head about are still practicing psychiatry.
Was there ever a time that you can remember where you thought we might lose the war, or you were afraid we might lose the war?
Yes, not us. Even Churchill said, the day we went in, we will win the war now. But there was a time when Britain almost was defeated, and it was Roosevelt's genius that I still can remember our family sitting around the radio listening to Roosevelt's fireside chat. And he talked about how he was going to plan the Lend-Lease agreement. And this was, we didn't want to give nobody wanted to give arms to Britain, but we were willing to lend them, and they were going to give them back to us. And that saved Britain, because Britain was really, they had been bombed to practically nothing. You know, London was in shambles. And I don't know if you remember, Bobby, when we went to, not Canterbury, what was that name, town where we got the cold drink? We were so hot.
Coventry.
Coventry. It was still not in shambles, but you could still see the effects of the war. And the other thing we owe to Roosevelt, Russia was so devastated by Germany. It was only that when we went to Volgograd just 4 years ago, there was only one building remaining in before the war. Germany had completely destroyed every building there, had starved the people, and then the parents were told that if they put their children in boats, they could send them across the Volga and be safe, and that the Germans had agreed not to touch them if a flag, the Red Cross flag was flowing. And as the children got in the middle of the Volga with the parents watching, Germans bombed them. So the Russians were just ready to do anything.
If you say you hadn't have gotten taken out of school and gone to the nursing, what do you think would be different in your life? Like if the war hadn't happened, or if you hadn't have gone to gone to help the cause? What do you think would be the biggest difference?
Well, I think a PhD from Yale would have opened
Right.
doors for me. So that I probably could teach in almost any school that I wanted to. I think that might be I wouldn't have met John.
Right, yeah.
So my whole life would have been changed. I think the most factor was that I would have finished graduate school had there not been a war.
I think that's it.